Our final speaker this afternoon is Donal Palcic from the Kemi Business School at the University of Limerick, where he's a senior lecturer. He's a big expert on public sector economics, infrastructure, policies, and the like. That expertise is obviously very important at this point, and he's going to talk to us about cost escalation in Ireland's public investment spending. Donal, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Sebastian. I'm going to pick up from where Niall left off earlier. He gave a really good overview of the planned ramp up, and he produces a much nicer charts than I can. So what I want to get through here is obviously there is the big planned increase in public investment, particularly by historic standards, between now and 2030. And, obviously with such a significant amount of expenditure of exchequer funds, you want to make sure that's spent efficiently, and you want to ensure value for money is achieved for the taxpayer. So what I'll look at briefly in this presentation is Ireland's track record in relation to coming in on time and on budget for major infrastructure projects in the past, what some of the kind of new things that the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform are putting in place in order to try and ensure that we see value for money being achieved and we don't see cost overruns for major projects in the future, and then maybe some other potential lessons that we could incorporate into what DEPR is already planning to do. Okay, so look, it's not like every single project that's ever been invested in has gone over budget and has been massively delayed, but particularly for maybe larger bespoke type projects in Ireland in the past, there have been some fairly high profile examples of major cost overruns and projects that have experienced significant delays. So you could go back a good few years and maybe look at the early part of the roads program in the late 90s and early noughties, where the program had been expected to cost roughly just under 6 billion, but a CNAG report from 2004 found that it ended up costing about 16 billion. Equally, around the same period of time, the first phase of the Lewis project, the tram in Dublin, was originally estimated to cost about 220 million Irish pounds or 280 million euro. And expected to be completed by 2001, but eventually, by the time it was opened in 2004, had ended up costing just under 800 million euro. Again, around the same period of time, the Dublin Port Tunnel had been expected to cost about 200 million. That increased, I think, to an estimate of 580 million in 2002. And again, by the time it was completed at the end of 2006, the overall cost had jumped to about 800 million euro. And more recently, there's been a really high-profile example of cost escalation with the National Children's Hospital, which had been estimated to cost just under 800 million in 2013. And most recent estimates are that it could be around 1.7 billion or potentially even higher once we get the final bill, once it's actually finally completed. If you look across a lot of those projects, there's some common reasons, some are kind of unique to each project, but a big one would have been usually not properly forecasting costs at the outset, at the planning stage, not adequately taking account of the kind of potential for construction inflation in the future, not even counting certain costs in some cases. It could be things down to contract variation, changes in project design, a lot of the kind of obvious reasons that you'd expect if you look across these types of projects across the world, where what we have in Ireland. Another really high profile one recently has been the National Broadband Plan, which is kind of the single biggest infrastructure project the state has invested in. But if you go back to 2012, when the plan was first announced, the government said the overall cost would be 350 million euro, with the state contributing 50% of that along with the private sector. But very little detail around the plan was given at the time. But a few years later, when the updated broadband intervention strategy was published, again, not really given a very definitive kind of estimate of the cost, but the cost of subsidy to the government at the time was being put at between 500 million and €1 billion. Unfortunately, when the project went for tender in 2016, we saw a really protracted, very complex and very controversial procurement process that lasted pretty much 4 years. And during that time, you would have seen all competition for the contract effectively removed. So there had been 3 shortlisted bidders. Air, the incumbent national telecoms operator that was privatized back in 1999. Cyro, which is the joint venture between the ESB and Vodafone, and another consortium of companies led by Granahan McCourt. But what we saw was essentially one of the bidders, Air, it decided to invest in 300,000 premises that were included in the original intervention area, which massively changed the business case for the remaining premises within the intervention area. The 300,000 that were taken out were essentially the easiest to get to, most commercially lucrative, and to get to the remaining 540,000 premises, you had to traverse a lot of that area. And once that happened, shortly after, Cyro left the competition, citing concerns about it just didn't have a business case anymore. But crucially, a few months later, Air itself decided to withdraw from the process, and you were just left with one remaining bidder. And by the time the contract was signed, the cost of subsidy, not just the cost of the plan, but just the cost of subsidy to the government had climbed to 2.2 billion, with maybe another $500 million in contingency costs. And since then, unfortunately, it's been plagued by delays in terms of the number of premises passed and how quickly they've been able to roll out the actual plan. And there's been a lot of questions raised also over the private financing side of things and the amount of equity being injected by the winning bidder. So I could spend a lot longer talking about this, but so what happened here? Essentially, you have a department that didn't really have it's a once-off kind of bespoke project, highly complex in terms of what it's trying to deliver, it wouldn't have had the experience of, say, procuring a very large-scale project involving private, essentially like a public-private partnership in terms of the option that they went with. Had to rely hugely on often expensive external expert advice, and they went with a very kind of rigid, complex contract design, which I think the last time I saw was the contract that's been signed runs to thousands and thousands of pages once you add in some of the variations that and add-ons that have happened since. There were big issues with the cost-benefit analysis. Like in a fairly unprecedented way, some of the correspondence between the then Secretary General of DEPR, Robert Watt, and the Secretary General in Communications, Mark Griffin, was published. And you could see DEPR flagging major issues with the cost-benefit analysis. I think the benefits were overestimated by about $1 billion, and really heavily criticizing or raising questions over the value for money of the project, given the sheer cost of subsidy of the plan, and some of the rates of return being earned by the private bidder. So I wouldn't have said that would have been a normal thing to happen around a project, to have all of that in the public domain. And one of the biggest issues was just, I suppose, a degree of optimism bias in terms of the ownership options that they decided to go with. So initially they looked at all ownership options, public to private. When they went to tender, they had it narrowed down to a PPP, a public-private partnership option, or the so-called gap funding model, which they decided to go with, which is essentially like a PPP, except instead of reverting back to state ownership at the end of the contract, it remains in private ownership. But critically, the level of competition being assumed to go with those options was hugely overestimated, in that they assumed a very strong degree of competition from established industry players with infrastructure assets that they could leverage in order to essentially attach strategic value to winning the contract, which would drive down the cost of subsidy to the government. But in reality, it's not just a question of 2020 hindsight. If you look at it, there are only two realistic bidders, Air and Cyro, that had infrastructure assets that they could leverage. So there wouldn't have been a very high degree of competition there anyway. But critically, also Air had signaled in advance of going to tender that they were looking at investing in a significant chunk of the intervention area, and the risk of that happening and what that might do for the plan wasn't really adequately taken into account. And as it transpired anyway, Air did follow through on a commitment deal to invest in high-speed broadband to 300,000 premises within the about 40% of the intervention area, which essentially massively changed the plan at that stage. So there's a lot of different reasons that went on there. You could look at a lot of this if you're familiar with the literature and say, well, so what, in that this is not a unique situation in Ireland, and it's only a problem in Ireland. Bent Fluver would be kind of one of the world's most foremost experts on the procurement of what they call mega projects or major infrastructure projects. And I think he coined the iron law of mega projects is, over time, over budget, under benefit, time and time again. In that, if you look across the world at a lot of the major infrastructure projects that have been procured, they share a lot of very similar types of issues. There's quite often very unrealistic forecasts. So systematic underestimation of costs and overestimation of benefits. At the planning stage, during the construction phase, often poor spending controls in terms of the governance and oversight of the projects as they proceed. A lot of projects suffer from political interference, and there's changes to project scope or design, which invariably lead to higher costs and delays in the projects, and also issues around transparency and accountability and how much information is put in the public domain. So we're not unique in terms of the experience we've had on some of our projects, and a lot of it, Fluberg will put down to, optimism bias, whether that's driven by overconfidence, the so-called planning fallacy, or as he kindly puts it, strategic misrepresentation. It really does come down to, it's not cost overruns that are the issue. It's cost underestimations and a failure to adequately account for risk that is often the biggest issue at the planning stage. So in terms of the planned ramp up in public investment, obviously DEEPR is very aware of some of the issues that we've had in the past. And if you look at the plans for investment out to 2030, there's about 50 projects that DEEPR are calling major projects, in that they have a budget of over 100 million euro. And what they've put in place is an external assurance process. So having a panel of external expert reviewers that will review any major project at two critical points when they're choosing the kind of preferred delivery option at the planning stage, and then critically at the decision point to actually proceed with a tender. So that's obviously a significant change to how they've done things in the past. And to support that process and to support DEEPR in its scrutiny and challenge role, they've also just established a major projects advisory group that consists of 4 external independent members, who will also be reviewing the various whether it's the cost benefit analysis or the different reviews that have been done as part of this external assurance process. So, grounds for optimism in terms of the significant changes here in terms of the governance of how these projects proceed and the decision points around proceeding with them. But only time will tell whether these will work, and hopefully those grounds for optimism aren't going to be as a result of optimism bias. Other things that I think could be taken on board in terms of lessons from the past, and I think Niall picked up on this point in his presentation at the beginning of this session, would be to actually take adequate to adequately budget for future maintenance and life cycle costs. So not just get it built and kind of forget about it, but actually adequately budget for ensuring that any asset that's built is obviously maintained sufficiently over its life cycle. And I think this is really kind of starkly put into the spotlight. If you look at the recent midterm review of the pilot public-private partnership schools bundle, so it was the first PPP project procured in Ireland back in 1999. There was a midterm review, I'd say midterm in inverted commas, in that it's a 25-year contract due to expire in 2027, and the review was only published in 2021. But it was really useful in that it had a comparator bundle of conventionally procured schools built at the same time, and they looked at a whole range of different issues. But one that really jumped out was the maintenance side of things, and their estimate of the backlog maintenance in PPP schools was minimal in comparison to how much maintenance was not being undertaken in conventional schools. And a lot of that comes down to the system of funding schools, and it's very ad hoc in terms of getting capital grants to do different works on schools. And very clearly there's a need for better systematic budgeting and expenditure being built in over the years on maintaining assets once they're built. So that does mean we need to strike a balance between maybe building quickly and cheaply. And we've seen this issue with the rapid build schools and the court case that's ongoing at the moment with the developer, where there's been big issues identified with some of the rapid build schools, versus maybe sometimes a higher cost in terms of investment, but better quality, and building an asset that is going to have a kind of better life cycle maintenance profile in the future. So that's definitely something that should be taken on board in terms of any investment that takes place. Another one, and it picks up on another point Niall raised earlier, is just around transparency and the types of, just actually having major detailed independent reviews of some of the big projects that we've had in the past. So that's not something we score very, very well on. There's been very few, you could probably count them on one hand, major reviews of major infrastructure projects. So if you look at, say, the PPP program, the CNAG had a report of the pilot schools project back in 2004, and there's been none by the CNAG of any kind of detailed review of projects since. And even if you look at the midterm review of the pilot PPP schools project that I referred to earlier, there's a lot of good things in that review, but I would say there was also some questions that you could raise around parts of the analysis within it. So one of the things you would have expected maybe a bit of a detailed review on was the whole issue of value for money and the cost of the capital costs associated with the program. But when they did look at this side of things in the report, less than a page, and in terms of how they presented maybe the capital costs for the PPP schools versus their sample of conventionally procured schools, if you read into the detail, it was quite misleading in how they presented it. In that one, for PPP schools, it was taking figures from the financial model that was agreed at financial close back in 2002 and spreading that over a 25-year period and presenting those in net present value terms, versus the actual costs incurred during the construction phase only in NPV terms for the conventional schools, and not giving kind of any detail on maybe the higher cost of financing related to the PPP schools. So, less of that type of review, and maybe having a more in-depth, independent kind of review that would reveal warts and all would really, really help in terms of our future delivery of PPP projects, etc. And just lastly, because I know we're probably slightly over time for the panel session, I'd point out that, you know, there are a lot of things that we actually do right. If you look at say even on the PPP side of things, investment, you know, Transport Infrastructure Ireland, which was the National Roads Authority previously, I mean, they have developed a huge amount of in-house experience in terms of procuring and delivering motorway projects, etc. Over time, and you know, from what we can see, it seems like they manage that process very, very well at this stage. Equally, the National Development Finance Agency, the NDFA, who procure PPP projects outside of the transport sector, they've also really developed significant in-house experience in procuring and delivering and then managing the contracts for a lot of different PPP projects over time. And there's potentially scope for, you know, using and utilizing some of that experience by maybe widening you know, the role of the NDFA to potentially procure non-PPP projects outside of transport. So an example of that is very recently, the NDFA took on the responsibility for the Devolved Schools Building Programme 2, which is a publicly funded programme for about 20 schools to be delivered, and really relies obviously heavily on the NDFA's experience with delivering a lot of different schools infrastructure in recent years. So that's something that we could very much look at. And lastly, just to reiterate the point, I mean, more resources should be given to bodies like the CNAG to conduct proper detailed performance reviews of major projects so that we can build up I suppose, a database of lessons to be learned and how best to avoid those types of issues in the future. It's one of the things that the IMF's PIMA report from 2017 highlighted, and I think Niall had it also in his presentation, saying it's one of the things that really hasn't been progressed. So there are equally lessons that could be added to how we best manage this plan of investment going forward. So looking at the time, I'll probably stop there and kind of take questions. I was just more conscious of the time.